This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. Let us talk about some more Emmanuel Levinas. We had covered him a few years ago on the Partially Examined Life. Someone early on had suggested we do him on this podcast. And I picked out of the Levinas reader that we used for our the articles that we read for our episodes, Martin Buber and the Theory of Knowledge. So it's essay 4 in the Levinas reader. It's page 59 or PDF 65 on what we'll link folks to. The essay was written in 1958. And I think when we read Levinas, we had read Buber not that long before that, and we were sort of wondering what actually is the difference between them. They both have a kind of religious Jewish existentialism that just builds ethics right into the existential moment. I'm right here in the world with other people, and just them being there and locking eyes with me, or maybe even not locking eyes with me, is amounts to a call to ethical action. So there's not really the problem that somebody like Sartre would have, where there's just nothing. I just can make my being out. Nothing is predetermined. Well, right there in the existential situation, I mean, I guess you could choose to ignore the call, but there's at least a pre-existing condition. Something is there that should give rise to ethics right away, and you don't actually need any theory for it at all. It's just right there. Does that match what you recall from these figures at all?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
All right, so Levinas being after Buber, how would he change this? I'm not sure how much of this article we'll get through, but let's start with the Martin Buber and the Theory of Knowledge. So it's not even about ethics offhand, but it seems like these guys can't avoid talking about ethics. We'll see if it actually dovetails with what I was just saying. Please proceed.
Okay. The theory of knowledge is a theory of truth. Like the Parmenides of Plato, it poses the question, how can the absolute being manifest itself in truth? For to be known, it must manifest itself in the world where error is possible. How can a being subject to error touch the absolute being without impairing its absolute character? It is reasonable to suggest that the efforts of ancient Greek philosophy were largely devoted to this question of how to mediate between appearance and reality. For in a universe conceived as a single whole, the gap between the two had to be bridged, and it was assumed that the mind need only reflect on itself to discover the one from which it derived.
I mean, the appearance reality thing, sure. But then equating reality with the absolute God, it's a pretty interesting move there right off the bat. I mean, am I reading too much into this?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a quick turn to the one. So
capital O1, yes.
Like the Parmenides of. Is there a boy band called The One? That would be ironic. I mean, that would be a good name, like five boys, but they're just The One. Am I making that up, or is that actually a band?
I think you're hit on something.
So the Parmenides of Plato. Okay, well, we know he's one of the one guys. How can the absolute being manifest itself in truth? Yeah, so it's a bit different than the way a contemporary analytic philosopher might articulate the problem of truth. But in a way, it is just another way of saying, how does a mind-independent reality manifest itself for us? And then if it does manifest itself to us, how can a being subject to error touch the absolute being without impairing its absolute character? Right? This is the thing that Hegel brings up in his introduction to Phenomenology, because it was a part, by that time, a firm part of the tradition, which is to wonder how the medium, whether the faculties of knowledge don't form themselves, kind of form a barrier to what is being known. right? Our conceptual scheme and all the rest of that.
Right. Right. We just
the mind need only and then the mind need only reflect on itself. That's the conclusion of the phenomenology. We know the absolute when we know ourselves. We know it best by knowing ourselves, because the logic of reality shows up most clearly in the logic of the workings of our own mind.
it was assumed that the mind need only reflect on itself to discover the one from which it derived. I mean,
yeah, okay, that's
I guess
a bit different.
That's a Platonic position. We just read Plotinus. It seems like that is his solution, not that I don't think he assumes it. He just, Plotinus says, well, I've done this. Just you could try it yourself. Empty your mind, try to get in touch with God, and there you go.
Well, and this is about method as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it sounds, I think, as you just mentioned, like recollection and having, already being familiar with the forms, and therefore only having to reflect as a matter of methodology in order to rediscover the truth. And it could be something as mundane as the Pythagorean theorem, or it could be something as highfalutin, not highfalutin as the as beauty itself, or something like that. In the Symposium, he describes a ladder ascent to a point where you can look out on an ocean of beauty, something like that. Yeah, and then all the way to the one, which I think for Plato would be the good. So,
right. I should add that for that Plotinus, that closing my eyes and there's the one is not a matter of knowledge. So it's not introducing the one into the world such that you could be in error about it. I mean, you'd think that if somebody told you, I can get in touch with God just by closing my eyes and emptying my mind, you could say, well, are you sure that's God? Maybe that's just, your neural, something neural going on. But, but I'm not claiming knowledge of God. I'm claiming an experience that, you just recognize. The only way you can just do it too. And then you'll know that there's that connection. And still, we should actually get around to reading William James' Variety of Religious Experiences soon. But I think this was a point from that. Still, it would not actually tell you any information like that. This is actually, because it's a positive thesis to say the one is that from which we derive. It's different to say there's a world that we all have access to if we close our eyes, and there's something special about that world. Okay, sure, maybe there's maybe that is a verifiable thing, but to then, it seems like it is a knowledge claim that is in fact the one, the absolute.
To say that what is the one?
Yeah, that you were experiencing, that thing you just experienced.
Close our eyes. Yeah.
Yes. It's a highly dubious knowledge claim. It's not.
Yeah. Although one, I do find the idea appealing, this idea that we, if there's, we're part of a world with some sort of ontology, and our subjectivity is part of that ontology. There's a foundation to it. And I like the idea that that there's some way in which we can experience that foundation by I don't know, some sort of meditative practice or introspection. I think wasn't Marcel on about this as well? The ontological need, and
right, by saying it's a mystery, though.
Yeah,
that seems to. It's probably compatible. Saying something that is a mystery is compatible with mysticism, but Plotinus seemed pretty sure that this is actually how we get in. It's not just that there's a mysterious larger world that we can somehow get in touch with. Like, no, I actually know that it's the one. It's not the intelligence. It's not his other layers of divinities. It's not, the special part of my soul. I mean, it is that, but it is the special part of my soul that is, when it's free of all material things, is coincident with the center of all being. And I can just be aware of that. I don't know if you want to not call it knowledge.
Marcel was talking a bit about the primacy of being over knowledge, right? And this making this claim that knowledge presupposes a more basic participation in being that is environed, quote unquote, by being.
Sure.
So yeah, there's some foundation or basis to cognition that or it's grounded in an ultimate identity between subject and object, between subjectivity and the absolute, I guess. So we've fallen away from it, but to rediscover it, we are in a way rediscovering ourselves, which sounds like Plotinus and Hegel.
Sure. I will shut up about Plotinus just because people will not have even gotten to hear that partially examined life yet, since we just recorded it. Although he does say that Plotinus does say the one is beyond being. So if the ground of being, anyway, this might just be a semantic issue of like, are you going to call the one being? Plotinus has reasons why he doesn't want to say that. He wants to say it's above being, but the way Marcel meant being might, sure, go ahead, include the ground. Yeah, no, I mean,
these are loose associations and that I haven't thought about, that we haven't thought about.
Well, let's proceed with the second paragraph. The problem of the subject-object relation, which arises in modern discussions on theory of knowledge, is an extension of this preoccupation of antiquity with the problem of truth. But it is no longer assumed that the agent of knowledge occupies a distinctive position in the hierarchy of beings which constitute the universe. The individual existent who aspires to the truth is radically separated from being as such. But if the implications of this separation were made clear, we would have to ascribe the metaphysical source of his being to the individual himself. Maybe let's stop there. That what you were just saying, if we were in the position to be able to close our eyes and get a hold of the ground of being, that would be a distinctive position in the hierarchy of beings, right? I don't think that a dog can do that, according to this Plotinus sort of thing that we've been talking about. But now the zeitgeist is saying, no, we are not special in that way. We are just animals. We are radically separated from being. And then Levinas saying, but the implication of that separation were made clear, would have to ascribe the metaphysical source of his being to the individual himself. I don't understand that at all yet, but we're in the middle of the paragraph.
I don't understand that either. Yeah.
For the latter is posited on the base of an inferiority which is not directed to anything other. The latter refers to the metaphysical, the individual himself, I guess.
Ascribe the metaphysical source of his being to the individual himself, because for the latter, the individual himself, or the metaphysical source of his being.
That does not seem like a good sentence construction here.
On the basis of an inferiority, which is not directed to anything other. I mean, normally I have to be inferior to some other. Individual, that is, the individual is fixed in a dimension where it has only itself as term.
I mean, this sounds like the Sartrean existentialist picture, or Camus or whatever, the traditional existentialist picture of we're all just these isolated things. We really only are contemplating ourselves. I mean,
it sounds like the standard critique of the Cartesian cogito. Mm-hmm. The individual is subsequently identified with the subject of knowledge or consciousness.
Yep.
Hence, understanding is construed not as one of the many activities of mind or as the superior function of mind, but as its very nature, that is, that which constitutes experience, its experience as parted, as breaking out from himself.
Yeah, what is the breaking out from himself? That, I mean, is it creating objects so that there's a distinction between thinker and thoughts? Is that the breaking out?
Well, yeah, I think that, yeah, the breaking out is the intentionality. It sounds maybe a bit like Sartrean nothingness, consciousness is nothingness.
Sure. Thus, for awareness or for the consciousness which accompanies our acts, nothing, in fact, is external. Every movement of mind, including that which relates it to an external reality, such as the acts of affirming, negating, willing, or even acts such as sensation, which indicate a dependence on an external reality, is construed as a pensée in the Cartesian sense of the term.
Pensée.
Pensée. The consciousness where finally the existence of those movements is acted, the knowledge included in it, is in the origin of all that comes from the exteriority.
All right, hold on for 1 second.
Yeah.
Affirming, negating, willing, sensation is construed as a thought. Okay, so it sounds like he's accusing Descartes of collapsing all these different cognitive functions into thinking. The consciousness where finally the existence of those movements is acted, the knowledge included in it, is the origin of all that comes from the exteriority.
Is in the origin.
Is in the origin. In the origin of all that comes from the exteriority.
I don't get that phrase.
Okay. So, you know, I get the where finally the existence of those movements is acted, as if consciousness, right? If consciousness is being treated as equivalent to all these other, you know, affirming, negating, willing, sensation. The knowledge included in that consciousness is in the origin of all that comes from the exteriority. All right, so we have to bracket that.
I mean, this sounds vaguely Hegelian, right? We're talking about the movements of consciousness creating, you know, basically the mind creating by having knowledge. It creates the subject-object distinction, and then we can track the movements of that. But just saying this, in the origin of all that comes from the exteriority, comes from means origin, right? So it is in the origin of all that comes from the origin, or is in the exteriority, you know, the origin, which is exteriority of all that comes from the exteriority. I don't understand why he would be saying that.
Right.
But let's go on. If one identifies the subject with consciousness, therefore, any event which occurs, including shock or injury, which disrupts the continuity of consciousness, has its source in a subject of awareness which exists in and by itself, i.e. is separated. Sure. Philosophy, to employ Husserl's term, is egology. That is the ego, the science of the ego. But if the phenomenology of Husserl, which has contributed to the repudiation of the idealist notion of the subject, is an egology, that is, rediscovers the universe within the subject which constitutes it, it is still an egology which has always interpreted the term self in terms of a consciousness which conceptualizes reality.
Okay. Looking above, we would have to ascribe the metaphysical source of his being to the individual himself. All right, let's go back down. Nothing, in fact, I mean, this sounds like solipsism, the kind of solipsistic idealism. Or is he accusing someone of solipsism?
We haven't thought for a long time about how or whether, you know, since we did all these different idealists and the romantics, how or whether Husserl is repudiating the idealist notion of the subject. You know, for an idealist, the whole world of experience is literally in your mind, and there's no objective external thing. You know, maybe the mind of God, but it's still.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a mind independent reality, right? And then Hegel is an absolute idealist, so it complicates things. For transcendental idealists like Kant, objectivity and reality as we know it as appearance is very different than things in themselves, but is still grounded in things in themselves. For Berkeley, it was grounded in the mind of God. For Hegel, it's, presumably grounded in, for Spinoza, right? It's everything is grounded in God and in a ontological sense. And then you turn that into a kind of idealism where, there's still a mind independent reality for Hegel as well. So I always get confused when idealists are accused of being solipsists or just saying that it's, the only grounding is in the head of a particular subject.
Well, for sure, for the idealist, we create whatever it is that is filling the field of what we experience, right? Whereas Husserl wants to just bracket that and say, we don't know if we create it. We don't know if the world creates it. We don't know if us and the world come together to create it, as Kant says. It's just there. Let's just describe it. And it includes subjectivity, so then this opens up for the whole Heideggerian picture of being in the world and all this stuff. For Husserl, it was still an egology. We are even if we're looking at like what the structures of the life world, how culture and all these other things enter into this world that we experience, these are all layers of the ego because it's our field of experience, right? By definition. According to this, I don't know if I haven't read Husserl recently enough to know if he calls it an egology, but yeah.
Yeah. Contingent facts can't come from the ego unless maybe you're Fichte and you want to say something like that all the data comes from the ego as well, the transcendent God ego, or it would have to be a God ego to produce all the data as well. But anyway, yeah. So someone like Kant can say, all the forms, all the categories and forms of intuition and all that stuff shape the form of reality as we experience it. But he can't say we're just making up contingent facts like the cat is on the mat. It appears to us in a certain way, but it has to correspond to some mind independent reality, even if that reality is unknowable and much different. So that problem of contingency, I think, is something that bedevils these sorts of systems.
Sure.
And in this case, so it's like, okay, anything that occurs, any event that occurs has its source in a subject of awareness which exists in and by itself is separated. I don't understand that critique.
Well, I think he's trying to state the position that he is going to criticize.
I know,
right?
Yeah,
okay.
Right. But I just think it's a straw man. I mean, it's not a real position.
At least the way he ends this definitely comes down that the problem with Husserl, which is the same as the problem with Descartes and most of the others, is that they're focusing on consciousness, which is the thing that Heidegger was trying to answer. And Levinas, I think, is somebody that was very in touch with that Heideggerian solution, that there has to be some sort of, it's not just a field of the Cartesian theater, a bunch of stuff laid out in front of a knowing subject. In fact, we are already, there's things that are contingent, sort of pre-experience, not contingent. There are things that impinge on us pre-experience. I mean, this almost sounds like with Plato's theory of recollection, but I hadn't really made that connection, but the idea that, we are a Heideggerian being in a world. And so the social, for instance, is not something we could doubt. The existence of physical objects is not really something we could doubt because they are just given as a precondition for everything. I think.
Yeah, this sounds like more in propositions.
Yeah.
Which I was just actually thinking of as well. So an egology, which has always interpreted itself in terms of a consciousness which conceptualizes reality, In other words, if we want to be skeptical in our epistemology, we have to take for granted that skepticism takes for granted a lot of common sense propositions about the world and about the self and consciousness, which so the potential is for skepticism to be self-undermining in that sense. If we don't know there's really a world out there and it's not really like how it looks to us, then why do we know so much about ourselves? In other words, we're interpreting ourselves in terms, presumably in terms of this conceptual scheme as well, through looking at it through the veil of that conceptual scheme. How do we have so much access, right? So for Kant, you're going to list all these categories. We have all this intimate knowledge of ourselves. Is that really more likely than us having intimate knowledge of the world? Seems fishy.
Want to keep going?
Theory of knowledge, then, in the contemporary sense of the expression, acquires a peculiar significance, for it leads us to original being. The subject has the function precisely because it is a subject of knowledge. The subject has that function precisely because it is a subject of knowledge. Thus, theory of knowledge is prior to all other types of philosophical inquiry, not only as a propedeutic of knowledge, but also as a theory of the absolute. Understanding, which is the very life and essence of being, implies a relationship to the object. The object is constituted by the subject as opposed to subject. This is Fichtean positing. But the opposition remains in the power of subject. But that opposition remains in the power of subject.
Yeah, this does sound more like Fichte than anybody else in terms of why would you think that just by focusing on theory of knowledge like Descartes does, right? There's nothing in Descartes himself that implies that I am discovering, just by positing that my whole enterprise here today is to figure out how I, this subject, can know things out in the world that are fundamentally separated from me, that I therefore, I guess Descartes thinks that he knows just by that I am essentially a thinking thing. So I guess if you take that being the ground of the human being is to be the subject, I guess that's just what he's saying here, right? I mean, that's not quite the Fichtean.
Yeah,
that I'm a subject that invents all the data that I then experience.
Descartes escaped Solipsism by getting God for us, retrieving God by suggesting that we can have certain ideas that must have reference. It's the ontological argument. So we escape our little solipsistic bubble because parts of that bubble imply the existence of a God, and then we can say, and God wouldn't be an evil deceiver. God lines things up for us nice. We're right. The correspondence reality of truth can work out after all because God makes it work out.
Right. So God is necessary to get us the outside world, but that initial insight of I know myself to be a thinking thing primarily in my essence, does he need God for that? Or is that just given, or does it matter? Definitely,
he doesn't need God for that. He doesn't think he needs God from that. Yeah, the self comes first, and then God is built on that.
Once you get God, then you can. Descartes thinks that he is confirmed that whatever is I conceive clearly and distinctly, I can legitimately call knowledge. He's already making use of that principle, or else he couldn't even get off the ground. Right? He couldn't think he has the notion of God. He couldn't think he has the notion of himself. He couldn't do I think therefore I am. He couldn't do any of this. So he sort of needs it, but it's a circular or a building argument that I have this hypothesis of clear and distinctness, and it comes up with this idea of God, and that guarantees that clear and distinctness, that I was right about clear and distinctness.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, he's doing a reductio ad absurdum, right? So he thinks he's only positing what his opponent is saying, which is that everything is doubtful and there is no external reality. I am in error about everything. That is the premise of the argument, is that whatever my subjective experience is, it's in error. And then the next step in the argument is that, well, there has to be someone who is having the experience of error, right? There must be the thinker, right? If I'm deluded, there has to be someone who's having the delusions. And so that is a fishy step. Because you might think that the self is just one of the things that's delusionally constructed, and that, yes, you could say, if I presuppose delusion or thoughts that are in error, then all I can get out of that is saying, okay, there are these free-floating thoughts that are in error, and one of the errors is to construct for themselves the illusion of a subject and a self, which is to the thought. So anyway, it gets complicated. It gets silly, but it is there is something compelling about Descartes' argument, and I don't know if you have to assume clearness and distinctness. But he does try to get us. He does try to get us outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, but what is being said here?
Well, I mean, it looks like a criticism of philosophy has been too focused on the knowing subject. Yeah. And as much as I appreciate the detail about, well, that's not really a good way of interpreting Descartes. Like, well, that's the legacy that he has left, I guess.
Yeah, and then when to say a theory of knowledge is prior, right? It sounds like, okay, we get bogged down in epistemology as a kind of propedeutic to ontology. Oh, we can't really know the world and its fundamental structure until we know how knowledge works. But it turns out in the German idealists that a theory of knowledge just is a theory of the absolute.
Yep.
Ontology and the structure of the subject, those two things converge in a very important way. So then the object is constituted by the subject as opposed to the subject. So this is, it's a German, this sounds like a restatement of at least Fichtean version of idealism.
All right, continuing. Both ontology and the theory of the subject-object relation have in common a notion of the truth as an expressible content, regardless of the particular structure of being revealed by that content. Hence, the truth is expressible in words, but the original function of truth on which such expression depends is to signify an inner meaning of a solitary mind which appeals to no interlocutor. Which appeals to no interlocutor. The monumental solidity of being hinges on this possibility of expressing the truth, of conceiving it as an achieved result, although being has in fact been interpreted from the time of the Parmenides and sophist of Plato as a relation, or since Descartes as thought, while the object in turn has been interpreted as the intelligible, though irrepresentable object of the physico-mathematical sciences. One of the most interesting facets of Buber's thought, our first mention of Buber, consists in his attempt to show that the truth is not a content, and that words cannot summarize it in any way, that it is more subjective in a sense than any other type of subjectivity. Yet, as distinct from all other purely idealist conceptions of the truth, it provides the only means of access to what is more objective than any other type of objectivity. That is, to that which the subject can never possess, since it is totally other. It is this aspect of Buber's philosophy which is closely related to certain main tendencies in contemporary philosophical thought.
Yeah, certain postmodern tendencies.
Well, what do you think of that? The first point about just, I tied to this idea of what are we? We're subjects and we grasp through knowledge objects. And that's the main thing. The fact that those objects then have to be expressible, certainly denying the subject object as a fundamental thing and denying that they're expressible is a similar critique. I mean, we're just giving that in terms of Plotinus, right? That we have this experience that is not knowledge and is very much not expressible. I think this is what you were referring to, Marcel. This is what Heidegger, the being in the world. I mean, we can try to express that, but it's saying being in the world is pointing to something that is more fundamental than language. And we could say the same, that Wittgenstein is also in this tradition and more.
I'm still a bit confused. The truth is expressible in words, but the original function of truth on which the expression depends, the original function of truth. So that sounds like a proposition, like a Platonic proposition or a Fregean. The expression depends, right? We want to say that an expression is true sentence.
Yeah.
Depends on some fact, which, okay, but here instead it's to signify an inner meaning of a solitary mind. This idea that these sentences are actually referring only to our own subjective experiences of the world. The monumental solidity of being hinges on this possibility of expressing the truth. I don't know how the solidity of being relies on the possibility. I mean, it seems to me that we could be incapable of expressing the truth, like our cats, silly cats, but being would still be pretty solid.
We're changing the name of this podcast to Cat Boys.
Purina.
Just so you know. Since my
like
dog has passed away,
example.
and we're both just the Cat Boys now.
Cat is the only example that really works. Cat on the mat. But
I feel that the cats do refer to no interlocutor when they are thinking about the objects of their solitary mind.
I meow, therefore I am. Okay, solidity of being hinges on the possibility of expressing the truth. I don't get that. Solidity, I guess if solidity is our sense that there's a mind-independent reality, okay, maybe that's it. Our sense that there's a mind-independent reality rests on this thing that we do where we think we can say true sentences. We can express the truth discursively. Gives us the sense of it, but I just don't. I don't even think that's true, because I think our sense of a mind-independent reality actually works at a non-discursive, habitual level, right? What's the word? Habitual knowledge or
procedural knowledge.
Procedural.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think that our sense of the solidity of being comes procedurally, not through expression of propositions. But maybe this is something, I don't know.
Well, are you just saying what he's attributing to Buber? One of the most interesting facets of Buber's thought consists in his attempt to show that truth is not a content, and words cannot summarize it in any way. Well, would we want to say that, my ability to ride a bicycle, that's knowledge, and I can't express it, but is that truth? I mean, it doesn't correspond to anything. The fact that it works, the fact that I can ride a bicycle with this knowledge means that the knowledge is true. Is that it's not actually even knowledge? You wouldn't want to call it that because it is not articulable.
Well, I mean, I just think we're right now we're talking about our sense that there's this mind independent reality, something that is other to us that simply doesn't depend on us. And yeah, we have all these practical ways in which we interact with the world, and we're just doing a lot of it unconsciously. If we pay attention to it, we can see that we're treating the world as if it were real. But for the most part, treating the world as if it were real and independently real is just a habit. And
sure,
even when we get to the point of conceptualization of the world, I think thinking of Wittgenstein, the language or meaning as use, I mean, I think concepts in a way are better thought of as habits or dispositions. A concept is much more like a disposition, I think, than a conscious mental content. So maybe that's the point here. Maybe you're right. Maybe he's pointing us to this sense that there is some kind of non-discursive engagement with the world that underwrites any higher level engagement.
Yes.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
But would we say that that habit, for instance, the habit of being in the world, Heidegger's phrase, is
Okay.
more subjective in a sense than any other type of subjectivity? Like, I would think not, because that was Heidegger's entire point, is that we're not going to talk about subjectivity. If you're going to critique this model, as Levinas seems to be doing, of seeing everything in terms of a conscious subject knowing things out in the world and being able to articulate it, then we're just turning away from subjectivity to say that there's, as you were saying, something more fundamental.
Maybe the point is that the paradigmatic case of us knowing being is just being a being. So there's a sense in which that's more subjective, right? So it's not paradigmatic cases of knowing the truth are not knowing the other. First, we have our identity to ourselves. Although that does sound a little bit more Cartesian, but I think, yeah, you can give a Heideggerian spin on that, right? So the experience of being a being, that, and this is Marcel as well, I think, but the experience of being a being is a form of knowledge, and that perhaps underwrites our engagement with the other.
Yeah, I don't think we have to say here that it's a form of knowledge, but we do have to say it is subjective in a sense. And then the second part of the sentence, yet as distinct from all purely idealist conceptions of truth, it provides the only means of access to what is more objective than any other type of objectivity, to that which the subject can never possess since it is totally other. So phenomenology presents certain things as transcendent, as other, that we find ourselves in a world, not just in a physical world, but in a social world. And that part of the feature of that is that there are other people. And we know that those are not just images on my retina that I can explain things about. And I would think you don't even necessarily have to talk about other people. Like, any object proclaims itself as impenetrable, as not in the same way, obviously, as another person who has its own qualia and subjectivity that I will never have access to. But anything, yes, is transcendent of my particular apprehension of it. It is not merely I was going to say not merely present to hand, but I don't think we might get to the point where both these figures, Buber and Levinas, would be critical of Heidegger's. I don't know if those are the only ontological categories or just the famous ones that we connect, but it's either we're taking something for granted and just using it and not focusing on it, which includes the whole background world, all of my habits and my knowledge, or it's present to hand, explicitly an object of knowledge, presumably articulable. So this has been a criticism of the present to hand, but does that mean that all the others are merely ready to hand? That seems like exactly why people think Heidegger is an antisocial Nazi, because yes, I'm steeped in this world, but there is nothing that is fundamentally other that has any moral bearing on me. I can just, maybe I'm just reading too much into, using things as a hammer.
Let me back up a little bit and say, so Descartes says, okay, the thing that we know best in a way is ourselves as thinking subjects. But the problem is the knowing ourselves as thinking subjects, where we get locked in that little subjective bubble, and then we need God to do a jailbreak for us. I think the point here is that it's similar in a way. The thing we do know best is ourselves, and Hegel would be on board with that, but we know ourselves best not just as subject, but as substance. We are part of the ontology of the world. We are beings within an ontology, and we know ourselves as beings. We don't just know ourselves as consciousnesses, but as whole beings, right? As consciousnesses cut off from the world, but as beings that are part of the world. And so we don't need Descartes' jailbreak into the other.
Right.
We get the other by going on analogy to ourselves and to our immediate access to ourselves as beings, again, not as conscious, not just as conscious egos.
Yep. Keep going. Or it's the second section, from the object to being.
All right. For contemporary thought, the history of the theory of knowledge is synonymous with the history of the vanishing of the subject-object problem. I wish it would vanish. I'm not sure it has. The subject, closed upon himself, once the metaphysical source of both the self and the world, is held to be an abstraction. The consistency of the self is resolved into intentional relations as for Husserl, or into the being in the world of Mitein and der Sein.
Mit ein
Mit
Andersein.
ein Andersein of Heidegger.
With another, being with others. Yep.
Right. Being in the world. Okay. The consistency of the self is resolved into intentional relations as for Husserl, or into the being in the world of Heidegger, or else it is identified with a continuous process of renovation, typified by Bergson's duration. The concrete reality is man already entering into relations with the world and are already projected beyond the present moment of his existence. Okay, this is kind of similar to what I was just saying, I think.
Yep.
Such relations are incapable of being characterized as representation, for the theoretical representation would only tend to confirm the autonomy of the thinking subject. But to combat successfully this view of an autonomous subject, analysis must discover, underlying the objective representation, the wholly different relations. Man is in a situation before he takes his place. But this is not to say that his adherence to being is reducible to a certain status in a hierarchically organized universe, or to the performance of a specific function as part of a physical mechanism without any recourse to the truth. What must be insisted on to any truth. What must be insisted on is that a relation with the object is not identical with a relation to being. And objective knowledge, therefore, does not trace the original itinerary of truth. Okay, that's a big idea. Objective knowledge is already bathed in a light which illuminates its way, and a light is required to see the light, for the philosopher as for the psalmist. It is in this sense, then, that we must reject the propedeutic and ontological privileges possessed by a theory of knowledge, solely concerned with the way in which a subject may be said to know an object. All right.
The first half of that paragraph, I think, is just confirming and restating what we have already been saying. But then, yes, he's getting a little weirder about this by saying it is objective knowledge, even though it's not objectifying knowledge. Like, I thought the whole point was the model that he's critiquing is a subject knowing objects. We want to say that's not the primary relation. We want to say that being is more primary than knowing. But then he's saying objective. Okay, so objective knowledge is not. I thought for some reason he was saying. Okay, so objective knowledge is already bathed in a light. There's something prior to it.
Yeah. So underlying the objective representation, which is to say, the objective representation he's associating with this model of having a Cartesian ego that's essentially cut off from the world. It's a different type of substance, right? The material substance, and has to represent it. And you get these mediating representations between ourselves and the world. It doesn't think carefully enough about the ontology, right? So we could start with an ontology that instead of having these two radically different substances that are cut off from each other, we could say, right, man is in a situation before he takes his place. So we could think of our ontology as consisting of beings that are in which subject and object are already collapsed, maybe in some important way.
Right.
They're dyadic, human being in a situation in a certain place in the world and in a certain position. But I think the point is that I think this is true. The Cartesian picture does mislead us a little bit by suggesting that we have this intimate knowledge of this interior space, and then everything exterior is just essentially cut off and mysterious. When, in fact, we could say we start with something else. All right. So what is he saying towards the end here? A physical mechanism without any recourse to the truth. Okay. Right. So he's not just a brain.
Oh, this was the part that I had never really thought about, somebody responding to Heidegger's like, hey, you're just a being in the world, to interpreting that as, oh, really? So I'm just a cog in the machine of the world? Like, that's just so obviously not what Heidegger is saying, that to even bring that out here is surprising to me.
Is he accusing Heidegger of
that? But to combat successfully this view of an autonomous subject, analysis must discover the underlying objective representation. Discover underlying the objective representation, the wholly different relations man is in a situation before he takes its place. But this is not to say that this adherence to being is reducible to a certain status in a hierarchically organized universe, or the performance of a specific function as part of a physical mechanism. That's what you were just saying.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like this is still a critique of the Cartesian position.
I just don't know who this is not to say, who he's responding to there. Why anybody would say. I think everything you've said so far today is true, Wes, but this is not to say that you always wear a bow tie. Like, yeah, of course, it's not to say that. That's not relevant.
What must be insisted on is that a relation with the object is not identical with a relation to being. An objective knowledge, therefore, does not trace the original itinerary of truth. So, yeah, objective knowledge in the sense of representational knowledge of an external other is not a paradigmatic case of knowledge, is the way I would put it. And our relation to being, it doesn't reflect our fundamental relation to being, which I would say in a way that I think is clear what's being said here, is one of identity, right? We have an identity relation to being. That's our primary relation, not a cognitive, oh, there's the other, I got to grasp it. Our first relationship to being is being a being. And you could call that an intimate type of, that identity relation, intimate type of knowledge that, yeah.
All right. I think this is all clear enough then. I think I was thrown off in initially reacting to this because I read, but to combat successfully the view of an autonomous subject, analysis must discover underlying the objective representation. I read it as must discover an underlying objective representation, as if there's the objective representation and then there's an underlying objective and that wouldn't make no sense. And so that's my confusion. But yeah, the whole thing
is objective representations are objectivity is bad. So far here in this picture, we want radical subjectivity of being a being. But go ahead.
Our critique leads us, therefore, to a knowledge of being and to a theory about this knowledge. But the knowledge of being does not resemble an object relation, with the difference that it is concerned with an object of a greater density and impenetrability, so to speak, an object more vast than the object of scientific knowledge. The original meaning of truth as a communication with a being consists in not being truth about anything. Not being truth about anything. I'm not sure which word to emphasize. It consists in not being a discourse about being. Not being a discourse about being. Being is not a theme of discourse, But in the original communication we have with being, the possibility of such discourse is revealed, and the context from within which objective propositions may be meaningful is delimited. For Heidegger, revelation of the truth diffuses that light which is necessary to see the light, and one must first react to the light before one can speak of it.
But don't go into the light.
For Bergson, truth is synonymous with choice, invention, creation, and is not a mere reflection of being. And Bergsonian intuition does not merely imply a union with being which extends beyond any purely external perception of being. Unity with being is invention and creation, i.e., truth is the essential act of being itself.
Told you.
We're going to need to read more Bergson to really understand any of that.
What? Yeah.
Despite our 2 Bergson readings, I know
truth
we have
is the
not
essential
read...
act of being itself. I just think this is what I've been saying about our access to being through being a being. So instead of through the other primarily, and then our access to the other comes through that. That's the light, right? So we right, knowledge is not the object relation. So then he gets sounds a lot like Plotinus. It consists in not being a discourse about being, being is not a theme of discourse.
Yep.
So we have a non-discursive access to being through being a being, I think. That's my interpretation. That's our original communication with being.
I mean, that's what it is really for Plotinus, is that we're identifying we are the one. We are the one. Everything is the one. So by definition, we are the one. We just need to realize that. We need to focus on the center of our being, which is the center of the one. And that focusing is not a matter of knowledge. It is a matter of being.
Yeah. But here, it plays an important part in grounding objective knowledge. So objective knowledge is the bad guy here, but only if we think of that as foundational. We have a more intimate self-knowledge upon which objective knowledge is built. So, and that foundational self-knowledge is what diffuses the light that is necessary to see the light. Diffuses that light which is necessary to see the light. So in other words, makes objective knowledge possible. And then, so then we get choice, invention, creation, which is he's taking a turn there, because that's not the way I would imagine. I didn't imagine that if my thesis is right, that this is about our identity with ourselves and the fact that we are beings. I don't know how we would say that is invented or created by us. Unity with being is invention and creation. So, maybe it's in creative acts, right? Plotinus doesn't advocate this, but we might think, well, being inventive and creative is when we are most in the flow and most in contact with being.
I think this is a tension within existentialism, that on the one hand, existentialism seems to be about the Heideggerian thing of realizing your fundamental place in the world that is before choice. But then for Sartre, who is criticized as being too focused on consciousness and the subject, just like Descartes, it's about throwing yourself, that you're not just thrown. I mean, yeah, you sort of made some fundamental choices before you were thinking about it, and that's why you are the person you are. But then you have the power then to shift yourself. So you are using choice, invention, and creation to determine your being. There's no pre-existing being. But for the Heideggerian point, and for I think the point that Buber and Levinas are going to be making, no, there actually is a human nature that you can't escape. You can't, that we are born as these creatures into the world. Again, not as having a specific function in this machine we call the world, but as having the human condition. I don't know. We've always interpreted those as, tried to make Heidegger and Sartre accord with that, because of Sartre, of course, you're also in a condition of having to choose. You're in a condition of being responsible. So we just said in existentialism, I'm never going to talk about human nature. I'm always going to just talk about the human condition. And you could talk about that for Sartre. You could talk about that for Heidegger. You could presumably talk about that for Buber and Levinas. But is there still a tension that term is washing over, that is trying to a chasm that is trying to bridge between some pre-existing thing about our nature and what we choose?
Should I read the last paragraph?
Yes.
This knowledge for contemporary philosophy is directed beyond the object towards being, but it does not seek being in the same way as it does the object. Our problem is to provide a positive description of this new orientation of the search for a theory of more ultimate knowledge. The philosophy of Buber should be envisaged in this perspective. All right. Well, I hope we get a clearer positive description.
Yep. So we'll for sure do a second part of this to actually talk about Buber. But I feel this was a helpful reorientation just within this whole, what are the continental guys doing to the traditional Cartesian knowledge-based view? Mm-hmm. Yes, it's ground we have trod over many times, but hopefully that we're reminding the listeners and we're reminding ourselves and trying to put this stuff together.
No, I always forget it.
Somebody had commented on the who's the moral realism guy, Railton, that we posted, that like, it sounds like you guys are just free associating, using philosophy 101 stuff. And that got me thinking how, I'm now finishing up my second semester of teaching basically a philosophy 101 course. And the fact that I could do that again and again and again, that in some ways it's inexhaustible. Like just trying to, yes, if we keep relating stuff to Kant and Hegel and Plato, and now we have when we have a few new pieces, we can throw around a few new names every once in a while. There's still just so much subtlety involved in any of it, and so much that flies out of our heads, that reminding ourselves of these things and keep reminding ourselves of like what the whole pattern of Descartes' meditations was. Like, I don't know. It's still useful to me. I don't feel like I should have grown out of this years ago.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of comment is not helpful. Yeah, I just think, I think to understand these things, you have to make these connections. These pieces are in dialogue with that tradition, and they're not being explicit about it often. So I think it's helpful to most listeners for us to flesh out what it is that this is what they're actually talking about, to some extent. So,
yes, whether it's useful for us to read one paragraph and then relate that to Heidegger, for instance, and then he actually talks about Heidegger in the next paragraph. Does that make us feel like, oh, we're so prescient, we understood what he was saying before he said it? Or is that just like, well, you should have just read the second paragraph to get a better idea of what he was talking about? I don't know.
I don't agree. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think trying to work it out for you. That's the important exercise. Try to work it out for yourself before you let the writer do it for you. Think for yourself, man. So, all right.
Or let us do the thinking for you. Please come back to the next episode of Close Reads at closereadsphilosophy.com and get all the extra portions that you might not get on the public feeds at patreon.com/closereadsphilosophy. Bye, everybody.
Bye.